So first I'd like to ask Susan Baldwin, our guest tonight, to introduce herself to you.
Thank you, Carl. My name is Susan Baldwin, and I am a former Sandag planner where I worked for 27 years. I also worked for the city of San Diego and the city of La Mesa as a planner. And I recently, since I retired a few years ago, I worked on the Save Our San Diego Countryside initiative that was on the March 3rd ballot, and that was the anti-sprawl measure, also known as Measure A. And I also am a member of Citizens Coordinate for Century 3 and a longtime member of the CR Club.
Thanks, Susan. And so my name is Carl Aldinger, and I'm a conservation organizer for Sierra Club San Diego. I started last April, and hopefully, if you folks don't know me yet, you'll get to know me a little bit more. I do help organize the volunteers throughout the county. And so we appreciate you again coming tonight, and let's get started. So Susan, to start off the discussion, I'd like to ask you if you could describe what sprawl is. And so what's the textbook definition of sprawl or urban sprawl? Have we always had sprawl, or did it come out of some particular time in society?
Thanks, Carl. Well, getting ready for this presentation was interesting because I have worked on sprawl and smart growth issues for 20 some years. And as someone who has worked on these issues, I admit that I sort of struggled to come up with a succinct definition of sprawl for tonight. So, I thought, well, it when you see it, leapfrog development. It's often, but not always, aesthetically unappealing, or at least unimaginative in its design. It uses land inefficiently. It's costly to provide infrastructure to sprawl development. It's automobile oriented and automobile dependent. It consumes agricultural land. It fragments habitat threatening endangered plants and animals. And all of these are pretty much true, but a more succinct one sentence definition that I found from the Nature Education Knowledge Project is also sort of descriptive. And that is, sprawl is generally typified as low density, haphazard development, spiraling outward from urban centers. To elaborate, scientists have argued for years that sprawling urban and suburban development patterns are creating negative impacts, including habitat fragmentation, water and air pollution, increased infrastructure costs, inequality, and social homogeneity. But you may be thinking, I live in a sprawl type of development. Or doesn't much of San Diego's pattern of development fit that definition? And you would basically be right. Sprawl has been the dominant pattern of development in the San Diego region and much of California and throughout the US, really since World War II. However, for many years, since the 1970s and accelerating into the 1990s, the negative impacts of this type of development, both environmental and social, as I've just described, have been known, and much of the work that I and other planners and environmentalists in the 18 cities and an unincorporated area of the San Diego region, and of course in other major metropolitan areas in California and elsewhere, have done work to stop sprawl development and focus. This is a recent, the past 20 years or so, and focus the majority of our growth in already developed areas to create sustainable, environmentally friendly patterns of growth. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So just a sec. Sorry, I'm just I don't know what happened to my notes. Oh, that's right. I don't have notes here. So basically, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about San Diego. And San Diego County has experienced, in the unincorporated area, has been experiencing sort of a boom in general plan amendments that are proposed for areas that were designated in the county general plan for semi-rural and rural densities. And these are proposed to be built in environmentally sensitive, high wildfire risk areas, areas that have few services and no transit. So the county general plan, I want to point out, however, since we're really focused tonight on the county, there is sprawl in some of the cities as well, but the county general plan without amendments, and I'm saying this because there's this, if you read the newspapers and follow housing, we're in sort of a housing crisis right now. But what I want to point out is that the county general plan, without the amendments that have been proposed, that 8 or 10 amendments that have been proposed recently, allows for over 60,000 housing units to be built in areas that are more, make more sense for development. And those are in the rural villages. They've been designated as rural villages, and those are places like Ramona and Lakeside, Fallbrook, Spring Valley, and Alpine. And so the Sprawl general plan amendments, examples are that you may have heard about are Lilac Hills Ranch, Newland Sierra, there are a couple of others, Valiano and Harmony Grove Village South, that have been proposed by developers in the past few years. But really, those are not needed to meet the housing needs of the unincorporated area. So my point here is that we don't need sprawl projects in order to meet our housing needs. And one other point I wanted to make is that the county does not have any affordable housing requirements for new development. So no matter what kind of new development is built, none of that housing is affordable at this point, although the county could put into place requirements for affordability. They have not done that. So I just wanted to point out a few other issues. The wildfire issue is huge, I think. There have been houses, 30 homes were lost in the Elfin Forest, Harmony Grove area several years ago. And that's one of the areas where developers have wanted to build more, sprawl types of development. And there are many more cars that would result from this sprawl development that could be stuck in traffic trying to evacuate during a wildfire. And it says wildfire season, but as we all know, we're pretty much in wildfire season almost all the time nowadays. The other issue related to sprawl development that I think is really important is the potential loss and the irreplaceable loss of habitat. And this is a lot of these sprawl projects that have been proposed in the county are affect areas that were in the general plan itself were set aside to preserve these ecologically significant areas, and the sprawl developments would potentially cause damage to those areas. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about the fact that there's an increase in traffic, and this will sort of play into some of the information that Carl's going to provide about SB 743. And these projects, which are located in areas which cannot be served and will not be served by transit because we just don't have the kind of funding resources to provide transit if you scatter development out into the more rural areas of the county. So there's an increase in traffic that would be really problematic if we do more sprawl development.
Okay, Susan, so sprawl is definitely not what we want. So if we don't want to freeze all development completely, what is our alternative?
So going back to my roots at Sandag, I want to focus on the smart growth programs and planning that has been done by Sandag and its 18-member agencies. And Sandag and the cities took up the cause, and the county took up the cause of smart growth over 20 years ago. And that work resulted in a regional comprehensive plan, a smart growth concept map, which I'll talk about in a minute, a smart growth toolbox, smart growth visualizations that could show how we can develop in our more urban areas and how there's room to develop in our more urban areas in much more environmentally sensitive ways. And we also, Sandag also put together smart growth design guidelines. And this work occurred during, around the same time that an important report was done. It was in 1995. It was called Beyond Sprawl. And if any of you are interested, you can Google that and find this amazing report that was prepared focusing on how California should grow in the future. And again, this was in 1995, 25 years ago. And the report was prepared by sort of an unlikely alliance. The Bank of America, the California Natural Resources Agency, the Low Income Housing Fund, and the Bay Area's Greenbelt Alliance. And I pulled one quote out of the report. It's got lots of really good information, but the report stated that California must find a new development model. We must create more compact and efficient development patterns that accommodate growth, yet help maintain California's environmental balance and its economic competitiveness. And we must encourage everyone in California to propose and create solutions to sprawl. So this is not, this whole issue of sprawl and smart growth, sprawl is, trying to prevent sprawl is not about stopping development. It's about developing in smarter ways. And so this definition that's on the slide before you right now is the definition that Sandag came up with in its regional comprehensive plan. Smart growth is compact, mixed-use development, good urban design and walkability. It's near public transit, and it provides people with more housing and travel choices. And at the same time, it protects open space and habitat areas. So this next slide is the smart growth concept map. And it's really, it was a really great collaborative effort between Sandag, the cities, and the county. And it has, it basically shows that smart growth is not a one-size-fits-all type of planning concept. It really, this map shows that there are many different types of smart growth areas, and they have different densities. So they range from the metropolitan center, which is downtown San Diego, which has 75 plus dwelling housing units per acre or greater, to the the rural villages, which are out in the county and which are, you know, you can see these scattered dots out in the county that represent the places like Alpine and Ramona and Fallbrook that I mentioned before. And those are also considered to be smart growth areas. They aren't served by transit, but that's where the county general plan, when it was adopted in 2011, said that most of the growth in the county should occur. And then the rest of the growth really should be in the western third of the county, which is in the incorporated areas of the region. So I'm going to end by talking about the county general plan. And so The county general plan was approved in 2011. It took 13 years to prepare, and it was prepared based on the work of the environmental community, planning organizations, the building industry. There were 700 meetings held, and to come up with this vision for the future growth in the unincorporated area. And so I just want to leave you with this idea that the county general plan, when it was adopted at Sandag, we were so thrilled because we thought the county has done a smart growth general plan because it really focused most of its growth in the rural villages. And in fact, the county general plan won 2 planning awards from the California Association of Environmental Professionals. And it won those awards because of how it, quote, sensibly tackled complicated land use issues and the fact that unincorporated lands have limited infrastructure such as roads, that 60% of its land exists on limited groundwater supplies, that much of it has physical constraints such as steep slopes that make it harder to develop, and that more than 2/3 of it lie in high fire hazard areas. So this plan was lauded by the planning profession as being a smart growth plan and really tried to get away from sprawl development. Unfortunately, in the past 5 or so years, we've seen developers try to continue to do the old patterns of development. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Carl, who's going to be talking about SB 743 and vehicle miles traveled, because sprawl has a lot of downsides to it. Particularly, I didn't talk about it that much, but the longer commute times, more congestion, and less access to walkable and bikeable communities and spaces. So he's going to talk about VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and how that is an important measure as we deal with our climate crisis.
Thanks, Susan. So in the broadest sense of the definition, VMT is the total number of miles cars and trucks in a given region travel in a given time. So that's what you aspire to represent with a figure VMT. Planners will also use VMT per capita or per person. So that's just our VMT divided by the number of people in the region. If VMT is high, we know we're burning more fossil fuels, resulting in more greenhouse gas emissions. And if VMT is dropping, we know we're burning less. Arriving at actual calculated VMT numbers is a bit more complex. Some vehicles are far more fuel efficient than others, but VMT is a factor that planners and regulators choose to use, even though it's based on averages. When we anticipate and predict future VMT, we use data that includes how far a person lives from their job, for example, or how far a person lives from where they shop or go to school. So the available data is rarely super current. We find this in all types of things. Try to look for, what the most recent things are, trends are with many things. You'll see the data lags a little bit in actuality. The most recent graph that I found on Caltrans site, citing some VMT data, and they do have monthly VMT, but didn't seem to be functioning right now under COVID. It does show a dip here with California total VMT during the Great Recession. You see a dip from 2008 for a few years. It's the blue line. And then you see it rising again. So we aren't reducing VMT in California, it's still growing. So smart growth can definitely help here. This is a nationwide VMT graph showing COVID-19 dip all the way at the end. But as with California, our country's VMT is rising out of control, not falling. So to reiterate, VMT is one of the best metrics we have to show relative trending in the increase or decrease of our use of transportation fuels. When we use mass transit, our movement is much more efficient in the use of fuels and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Full buses and full trains have lower emissions per commuter. So you can think of mass transit as a hack to get more movement with less VMT. Of course, we at Sierra Club want to see a rapid transition to zero emissions mass transit powered by the sun and the wind. A bus with 40 riders can represent a savings of roughly that many cars and their accompanying VMT, and a full train can represent hundreds. Since VMT is the most workable metric we have for an otherwise impossible emissions calculation problem, the state of California has used it in Senate Bill 743 to help mitigate climate change and improve quality of life when considering new development. So undoubtedly some of you are out there thinking, what about electric cars? I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is electric cars are better than gas-powered cars for sure, especially when they're powered 100% on renewable energy. But the bad news is we still need to radically reduce VMT to make our climate goals. Electric car adoption isn't fast enough, and in terms of congestion we experience here on our freeways, it gets no better if single occupancy gas cars are replaced by equivalent single occupancy EVs. I hope to talk more about electric cars in an upcoming presentation. So I've been learning a lot about SB 743, and I have to say it's a little nerdy. We've talked about sprawl, smart growth, VMT, and because 743 is a challenging law to describe, I'd like to show you a video produced by Caltrans that does a good job of summing it up. So sit back for a while and follow along to see how SB 743 was crafted to promote better development outcomes.
Senate Bill 743, rethinking how we build so Californians can drive less. Along with other state initiatives underway, SB 743 aligns with 4 urgent priorities for California: improving our transportation system for everyone, meeting our climate targets, meeting the challenge of the housing crisis, and extending our commitments to protect the environment, while enhancing equity and quality of life for everyone. SB 743 provides a new method for Caltrans and local agencies to analyze the transportation impacts of land development and infrastructure projects. The new method focuses on reducing the need to drive so that cities and towns of all sizes can direct development to local commercial and job centers while supporting existing neighborhoods. We can encourage development that strengthens communities and doesn't force people into long commutes or auto dependence. The governor signed SB 743 into law in 2013. In December 2018, after over 5 years of collaborative, stakeholder-driven development, the new amended California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, Transportation Impact Guidelines were adopted. For the past 2 years, Caltrans, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and the California Air Resources Board have worked to provide information through meetings and webinars to ensure a smooth transition. And SB 743 goes into full effect in summer 2020. California is a global leader in the fight against the devastating effects of climate change. And there's good news. We have met our 2020 climate goals, mainly because of our dramatic progress in switching to renewable energy. The next big challenge is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation to meet our 2030 goals. In California now, about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions come from vehicle tailpipes. And when you factor in refining fossil fuels to run our vehicles, the full impact of transportation sector emissions becomes clear. Transportation causes 50% of California's GHG emissions. Better fuel efficiency, cleaner fuels, and more zero-emission vehicles will reduce GHG emissions, but not quickly enough. Reducing car use is also essential. Before we look at what will be different with SB 743, let's look at what will not change. The state's commitment to SB1's Road Maintenance and Rehabilitation Program is firm. It is not changed by SB 743. Projects that reconfigure existing roadways, calm traffic, or enhance safety are not affected. Projects to enhance walking, biking, and taking transit are not affected, and paving projects will continue. The change is that for development projects, SB 743 means public agencies will no longer identify localized traffic congestion as a significant impact on the environment. We will now measure vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. VMT is the amount and length of new vehicle trips generated by a new development project's residents, visitors, shoppers, and employees. Analyzing VMT in relation to proposed development projects takes into account whether a new development is located close to jobs, businesses, and services that enable short trips and travel choices besides driving alone. VMT changes transportation analysis from measuring the impact of a proposed project on drivers to measuring the impact of driving on the community. SB 743 aims to move more people with fewer cars, so we are not stuck in traffic. The main elements are streamlined development projects that address the affordable housing crisis and deliver walkable, livable neighborhoods. Promote developments in locations where there are alternatives to driving alone in cities and towns of all sizes. Change the way new transportation investments are analyzed, focusing on their impact on total driving, and support walking, bicycling, and transit use. Why make this change? Because the ways we have studied development and transportation proposals in the past often resulted in unintended outcomes that are out of step with California's vision for the future. We have been measuring whether a new development would cause traffic delays during rush hour. But rush hour congestion doesn't really tell us if the transportation system is efficiently getting as many people as possible to the places they need to go. If a proposed project would make congestion worse, the sponsor of the project was often required to pay fees, called mitigation. They might have to pay to help add lanes or widen an intersection, for example, which often didn't really ease traffic at the busiest time of day. Projects in areas that were already congested, even if they provided community benefits, new housing, or retail space, often triggered a need for expensive mitigation. Developers would often reduce the number of housing units in a project to reduce anticipated congestion. With required mitigation, sometimes entire housing projects just became too expensive to build. The cost of mitigation often became an incentive to instead build in outlying areas where there was less concern about congestion. And that unintentionally reinforced auto dependency and created longer commutes, which also led to a loss of open space and the costly extension of services. Reducing how much we drive, our dependency on our cars, is a big challenge, but we will share big rewards. By reducing our dependence on cars, we can combat climate change and meet California's state law to reduce GHG emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. We can increase housing. A new tool called SiteCheck shows low VMT areas in green throughout the state. Housing development could be streamlined in those green zones. Housing in central city areas and surroundings generate low VMT. Infill development, including in many suburban communities, also generates low VMT. And small and mid-sized cities and towns that are not bedroom communities generally have low VMT too. Every region and every city in the state, including rural and suburban areas, has green zones. SB 743 changes how both development and transportation projects are analyzed. Let's take a closer look at future housing development with SB 743. About half of all future housing across the state would not be required to analyze VMT transportation impacts at all. Projects that are in the green zones or within half a mile of transit, those that provide affordable housing or would generate fewer than 110 trips a day, are streamlined. That also means that VMT mitigation would not be required. You do not need to make streets or intersections wider. The project is streamlined. Of the remaining projects, the VMT analysis will require only about 20% of the time and cost as previous analysis. If there's less than a significant impact, no VMT mitigation is needed. If mitigation is needed, developers have many low-cost options, and some can even make the project less expensive. For example, for urban projects, you might reduce parking or add car sharing, or you might add bike and pedestrian facilities. For suburban projects, you might enhance the grid and connectivity, subsidize transit fares, or ensure live workspaces for telecommuting. And for rural projects, add bike and pedestrian trails, workforce housing, or facilitate carpooling. If it's just not possible to mitigate to a less than significant impact, there can be a statement of overriding considerations if a project is valuable to the community and documented benefits are judged to outweigh the negative impact of VMT increases. In addition to streamlined housing, SB 743 offers Californians more benefits. More housing near jobs can reduce transportation costs, which are, on average, second only to housing costs in household budgets. Long commutes to find more affordable housing in ex-urban areas often have disproportionate impacts on lower-income families. Previously, traffic mitigation often led to too wide streets and places where driving is the only way to get around. The character of small and rural towns was often lost. Instead, SB 743 helps preserve small towns and rural character. And spending less time in traffic commuting means we can spend more with our families, participate in more school events and civic engagements, and do the things many of us haven't been able to do because we spend so much time behind the wheel. You can find more information on the Caltrans website at dot.ca.gov and on the Office of Planning and Research website at opr.ca.gov. Just enter SB 743 in the search bar and click. With SB 743 in place, California is at the forefront of innovative and creative strategies for transportation, increasing housing, protecting our environment, and improving our quality of life.
So, thanks, Carl. That was really interesting video. It really helps explain SB 743. And it brings us to the important question: why is the Sierra Club suing the County of San Diego? I thought that the Sierra Club was made up of friendly neighbors whose main interest is protecting the environment. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure, Susan, thanks. But before we describe exactly what's going on with the lawsuit against the County of San Diego, I do want to take a moment to talk about why we use the legal system to hold our own government accountable. Most of us were taught that government is here to serve the people, and we sometimes conflate that with the fact that whatever government does must be right. But governments are run by people who have to make decisions about how to implement and enforce laws and policies. We hope they always get it right, but when they don't, the legal system can often be a method to stop improper implementation of the law. Sierra Club has successfully sued the County of San Diego twice so far regarding the flawed climate action plan that the county had. This has forced the county to go back to the drawing board and try again with the knowledge that they need to get it right, or those in the public who are watching them will sue to intervene. So I hope that frames a little bit better why our beloved environmental conservation and justice group, the Sierra Club, is rolling up its sleeves and through your support is hiring legal counsel to hold officials to enforce the law correctly. So what did the county get wrong with this SB 743 implementation? The county created a scheme where they divided the county into regional zones based on density. They reasoned that less dense areas weren't required to meet the same standards as more dense areas, and determined that they would be largely exempted from the enforcement of SB 743. Now, to be clear, most laws like SB 743 do have clauses that allow for some exemptions, but being rural was not a valid reason to create such an exemption. In fact, understanding the spirit of SB 743, you have to come to the realization that it was crafted to discourage large developments in very rural areas, precisely because it is the definition of sprawl, and it brings with it all the downsides that we mentioned earlier. So the Cleveland National Forest Foundation and the Coastal Environmental Rights Foundation reacted. Along with the Sierra Club, we expressed strong disagreement with the county's proposed implementation in letters to staff and in public comment. The staff forged ahead and asked the County Board of Supervisors to approve, and they got that approval. So we went off to court. First, I'm going to just cover the assertions. They're not that long, and I think it's important to just describe those kind of, now that we've framed the scenario of SB 743. So the first thing that the lawsuit contends is that the county establishes a threshold of significance under which the projects with VMT 15% below the existing regional average would be considered to have less than significant impacts. But the county manipulated the average regional baseline against which a project's VMTs would be compared. Rather than using average VMT across the highly connected integrated San Diego region, as expert state technical guidance recommended, the county instead used a much higher average VMT baseline derived exclusively from largely rural unincorporated areas. The county thus inflated the baseline against which the 15% reduction threshold must be compared. Because the baseline is so much higher, future projects with higher VMT will fall below the county's threshold, and those projects' transportation-related impacts will never be analyzed or mitigated under CEQA. Second, the county adopted an unsupported screening threshold for purportedly small projects. Under this threshold, the county concluded that all of the residential developments in unincorporated rural and semi-rural areas where vehicle trips reasonably would be expected to be the longest, would be small and thus exempt from VMT analysis and mitigation. And then finally, the county refused to analyze the environmental consequences of adopting these sweeping exemptions. Instead, the county found that SB 743 implementation project itself was exempt from CEQA based on a series of dubious rationalizations that lack legal and evidentiary support. So that's it in a nutshell. Sorry to bog you down at the end there with the legal arguments. Those are always sort of tricky, as is the general concept of SB 743, but hopefully we made it a little bit more clear. As Susan instructed us in the beginning of the presentation, we've inherited sprawl, and there are serious problems with it. Planners of San Diego, as part of the general plan, have designated a smart growth system for us to all work with, and the infill that accompanies it will be better for our communities and better for mitigating climate crisis. SB 743 was crafted and passed to make municipalities and planners work towards these goals. Now we as residents and advocates have to help reinforce our commitment to do so. So before we move on to to answer questions that you might have, I'd like to take a moment to thank the volunteers who work with the Sierra Club, advocating for our climate, for justice, and for environmental protections. We need you to help keep good policy and outreach moving forward. I know many of you are working hard during this election cycle, and unfortunately, our work doesn't stop after November 3rd. If you'd like to help move beyond membership and also volunteer a few hours a month to help Sierra Club make great progress in climate, justice, and the environment, please reach out to me. My email address is on the next slide. Okay, so this is a portion where we'd like to take questions from you. I'm gonna take a look in the chat, see what I can say. I didn't see a lot coming in, but feel free to go pop them in there now. I guess let me start with a comment from Ron, who says his wife and he lived in a suburb 20 minutes north of Barcelona for 4 years, and it was very walkable to all the stores, restaurants, and shops. So yeah, that's a great example, Ron, of it's not sprawl. If it's a 20-minute walk, that's pretty awesome. And especially with biking and e-biking, that's a very connected situation. And I assume that the schools were also in the same region. We don't always know where we're going to work when we move to a place, and I know that's a big challenge. We've got 2 working folks in most households now. And so that means you may set down roots one space thinking that you're working in a job center somewhere, and then at least one of you gets another job somewhere else. So we do need the transit to be really good, and that's where it helps to settle these new homes close to transit. So Paige asked, doesn't the state have guidelines for less than significant threshold? And I don't know, Susan, if you have a good answer for this, because you probably haven't worked as hard on 743. And Dave, if you have any recommendation as to whether or not the state gave really tight guidelines. I know Dave Grubb is working on a set of best practices that we can help pass on to all the cities in the region, because they are all asking, we are asking all of them to help interpret 743 as they approve new developments. I may have to get back to you that on that For You page about whether or not they had really tight guidelines. When you watch the deliberation from the county, they seem to be really broad in their interpretation, which was scary. So I'm going to say that there probably were not very strict guidelines, or they would have felt the need to hold to them. But that said, this is why we have us as watchdogs, and I don't imagine the lawsuit would have happened if their interpretation was anywhere close to what the law was actually asking for.
Sometimes it's easy to find loopholes from state legislation. So no, the 15% is, I don't think the 15% is written into what was in SB 743, but what was very dodgy and frankly quite hard to understand when you read about how the county tried to interpret it is that the county decided to break the entire San Diego County into 5 separate regions, and these look like kind of redistricting regions where they were broken up by density. And then instead of saying, well, these all have reasons for us to weigh, but they all follow the same VMT rules, they did not do that. Instead, they started to say, well, the 15% variance from each region's rules are what counts. And so then you saw them giving examples of, well, we try to put this housing community in, we'd see it not be a significant difference in region 3 and region 5, but it would be in region 1, 2, and 4. So that would trigger them to do an analysis. So it was a little hokey, but I know one of the things that we were wishing for or expecting is that they use the same standard throughout the entire county. And if they had done that, what we expected is that it would have biased the development towards infill and would have essentially given more preference to anybody trying to do infill development, and would have had more serious mitigation penalties for anyone trying to develop in the backcountry. I hope I'm getting that right, Dave. Again, please feel free to step in and correct me if I get any of that wrong. And my guess is that the county is not going to be sticking with the plan that they had started with. We did see that the city did much better with their plan, and I think Vista's already described a plan that we thought seemed pretty reasonable. But again, each of these 18 cities will also have to sort of understand and interpret what 743 means, and then apply those standards. That probably is a failing in 743, that folks have to even try to figure out how to interpret it. Does anybody else have any questions for Susan in general about sprawl? I know when I was asked to help endorse a measure against sprawl more than a year ago, I reached out to Susan because she and I had worked together working with the Sunrise Movement.
And I knew that she was doing work in housing and had a lot of experience as a planner. And when I told her, you know, my misgivings with like, what am I going to do? I live in Sprawl, or at least I thought I lived in Sprawl. And, you know, one of Susan's responses was, it's okay to understand that the way that you purchased your house or the community that you live in is not what we want for the future. So it's better to feel a little bit hypocritical and get over that and then work towards a better solution moving forward than it is to somehow internalize some sort of guilt that, oh, I did it wrong, so I should expect everybody else to do it wrong in the future. And I guess even from watching tonight's presentation, I had a little bit of glimmer of hope that living very close to the town of Fallbrook, that I'm not as badly sprawling as some of the other communities that I thought, you know, we were in the same camp with. In fact, I think Fallbrook was the last community that was shown as a little dot on one of those earlier maps. So, you know, it goes to show that we do have smaller communities, but the general plan allows for us to build as long as there's some kind of center in those communities. But of course, it always benefits when we infill and when we get closer to the job centers. How about VMT? Is anyone confused by, you know, why we talk about VMT, why that's the big to do? It seems kind of obvious, and then you start to dig into it and you think, well, it's such a broad brush metric. I don't know whether that's what we should be using. And I guess I rationalized it with, well, planners have to use something, and they can't try to survey everybody. When I was doing this presentation, or putting this presentation together a little earlier, I asked my wife, because she handles the registration for our cars. She has for many years. And I said, have they been tracking our odometer mileage when we put in our vehicle registration each year? She's like, no, absolutely not. Our insurance company asks for it. It didn't used to ask for it. And so that leaves us with the question, how does the county, how does the state know how many vehicle miles we're traveling? You know, they're not tracking it. There could be some cryptic law out there that says they're not supposed to track that unless they change the law. But right now, they don't know how many miles we're traveling, so they have to make gas.
They do from your biannual smog check.
Okay.
That's how they're getting it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I know also when I was reading how they do the monthly VMT for Caltrans, they said they use a sampling of 20 spaces and they just interpolate from there. So sometimes it's very broad brushed when they're trying to do these estimates. And it's tricky for sure. You know, they don't know when we've been traveling in-state, out of state. It's tricky. They also don't have any idea what the efficiency of our cars are. But in the end, what planners have to do is discount some of that stuff and just know in general that if we're traveling more than we used to, if we're traveling more than we need to, then that's something that we can improve upon. Okay, there's a question here. Ellen asked if we'll make the recording available, and yes, we will do that. So thank you for asking that. I'll make sure that we post it out. What we did last time was post it on YouTube, and then I will send out on our social media where that link is. And we can probably try to do a follow-up also in the newsletter for Sierra Club San Diego newsletter. Patrine asks, how do you propose to incentives to developers not to want to continue to create more sprawl? Susan, you want to take that?
That's a tough question. I think that, you know, the increase in housing capacity in the general plans and the zoning ordinances of the cities that, you know, from basically says, you know, we should be developing housing by increasing densities in places like, say, Mission Valley or Kearney Mesa in the city of San Diego, places like University City, that provides opportunities for development in those areas. And so in these already urbanized areas. And so, and then I mean, really the county general plan itself, it's not an incentive, but the down zoning that was done in the county general plan in 2011 was, they actually in the county, they upzoned at the same time they downzoned large swaths of the sort of eastern part of the more eastern parts of the unincorporated area. They increased the densities of the rural villages to sort of counteract that and to provide opportunities for development in those rural villages and the surrounding areas. So that's sort of what the trade-off was in the county general plan. But what happens is the developers, these areas that were downzoned, they are, the cost of land in those areas is lower because they were downzoned. And so the developers are trying to buy this lower cost land that was downzoned on purpose so that they can, make a larger profit when they build housing. So, but the problem is that by building housing in those areas, they cause more costs that will have to be borne by the new residents, like for schools and fire stations and libraries, and they also potentially create the need for more roads. So it's a more expensive proposition than trying to build closer in not doing leapfrog development out into these more rural areas. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think providing opportunities for infill development in the cities, which has been done throughout the region. All the cities have provided more housing opportunities. They've had to because of their housing element requirements. That is another state mandate. But, trying to focus the development in these areas where we already have services. Not that they don't need to be upgraded in some cases, but we don't have to build brand new schools and fire stations and libraries out in the hinterland, in places where people will have to drive much greater distances.
Yeah, it's a tough call. I mean, honestly, it looks like the situation is developers will look for the biggest swaths of land that they can find, that they can develop, if they can get the funding, the most units so that they profit with economies of scale. And so that puts us in a situation where if they're trying to seek that type of development and they're not respecting the SB 743 rules, the general plan, these ideas about sprawl, we're going to keep fighting them, and so we hope that they look at that and say, this is not worth that battle, and that they can do better and try to find places to develop that are more friendly to what this general plan is.
I'm looking through some of the questions. Yeah, we have to think about SB 743 was developed before COVID and before so many people are, now working from home, which we don't know how much of that will continue. And that sort of changes to some extent. I think that changes some of the, I think it changes how we think about planning. I mean, planning is an iterative process. It never stops. And you have to keep taking into consideration new information. And, I think when sprawl was first being talked about as a problem, the climate issue wasn't front and it was known, but it wasn't front and center. And I think that's become, although I didn't really mention it, that's become one of the reasons why, an additional reason why sprawl is problematic.
Well, folks, it's 7:30, and the best way for me to get this out onto YouTube is keep our recording just under an hour. Otherwise, I get penalized, and we can't get it up there to share with you all. So I really appreciate, Susan, you taking the time to come and address this subject with us today. It was super helpful. For those of you that don't know, Susan's very active to this day on everything, and she's got a big presentation to do tomorrow. So good luck with that, Susan. And I really appreciate it once again for you taking the time to work with us. Thank you to everybody who showed up today. If you're not already a volunteer, I'm sure that you're all probably doing something somewhere. So I want to recognize that too. Just because you showed up here doesn't mean that you're not volunteering with another organization. If you find that you have some time to spare and you would like to work with the Sierra Club, please reach out to me. Again, that's carl.aldinger@sierraclub.org. And I would appreciate hearing from you if you're interested in volunteering with us. We always have opportunities to help us with climate action plans, with advising and asking our local officials for help in mitigating climate crisis and improving our policies everywhere. So thank you everyone tonight for joining us, and we'll see you again around this time next month. We'll send out another reminder about our next presentation.
Thanks, Carl.
Good
Thanks,
night, everybody.
everyone.